This is the Tallahatchie Bridge, which is actually located in LeFlore County, Mississippi. It's an old iron bridge that somehow survived the Army Corps of Engineers purge. And they went up and down the Tallahatchie and all these rivers around here and got rid of all the old iron bridges. It may or may not be the famous Tallahatchie Bridge from the Ode to Billy Joe song, which was made famous by Bobby Gentry in the 60s and still resonates today to anybody who hears even the opening bars of that song, where they were when that song came on AM radio, and there was actually a song about the Delta, which told a mysterious story of a boy and a girl, and they threw something off the Tallahatchie Bridge. Really quite mythical.
We each have images of this Tallahatchie Bridge. Taking my kid to school, I would come back on this back road. Usually, to be honest with you, I had to pee. So I'd have to get on this gravel road, which took me around this way. So I have a number of photographs of this bridge that this morning had the frost, had a flight of birds going through it. And essentially, this bridge had been photographed and it was already in a book by my wife. So this is an homage to her. And it is, in a sense, for this hallway of landscapes, what kind of, in our minds, tied the whole thing together. And we've kind of turned the whole hall into a room of landscapes. Mine, of course, are color, hers black and white, but they reflect the same world. And this one, well, the thing about taking photographs, sometimes you just see something and bingo, you snap it and you sort of know you got the prize winner. Other times you're on a hunt, and it could be for months or even years, and you have a specific thing. You'll see later the cars photos. After that, I did a series of horses. In this case, I was looking in the Mississippi Delta for crop dusters to fit in with the whole Delta farming series that I was working on for a book, Year of Our Lord. It's about a kid who's no longer a kid, he's probably in his 30s. Was born with cerebral palsy, which happens when oxygen is constricted at birth, and who has plenty of friends, but who is very specific about where he likes to be or who he'll put up with. In his case, he's from a well-to-do family. He doesn't put up with the Episcopal Church, and he goes to the black church, and he sings in the choir. So the whole book is about race, class, and also about disadvantage within advantage, kind of all rolled up as a Delta story, although you could find that kind of story pretty much anywhere in the world. So to that degree, kind of universal. And in the setting of farming, and in the case of his grandfather, it was catfish farming. Anyway, the crop dusters go back and forth, spraying poison. So I saw him and I figured, well, I'll pull into this cemetery, which is near us. And this statue actually is photographed in Bill Eggleston's guide, William Eggleston's guide. There's a shot of this with a friend of ours, Bob Bailey, whom we just had his funeral 2 weeks ago. Anyway, this statue has some kind of sentimental meaning for me, so it's a kind of a go-to place. So there's the crop duster. There's my favorite angel, and then there's the cross with Jesus, and then the two thieves. So if you want to see it as a symbolic thing, you can. You don't have to. It's just the way I see it. The main thing is, in an image like this, you want the foreground with the statue, the middle ground with the trees, the background with the soybean field and the crop duster to all kind of become one, so that your eye is drawn from the front all the way through to the back. You know, if you're a photographer who's trying to show what the world looks like, you want people's eyes to go all the way through.
Well, this is a photograph that's taken out from Sumner, where we live, on what they call the Brazil Road, and that's Brazil, Mississippi, by the way. And it's called the Good Earth tree because that's the location. The name of the cotton farm was Good Earth. So it's symbolic for, I guess, surviving and just persevering. It's been hit by lightning in this particular incarnation several times, but I just kind of passed this tree for many years before I actually stopped and thought, you know, I better take a picture of that. And sure enough, it is totally gone now. It was struck several more times by lightning, and then somebody tried to burn it. It was, for whatever reason, was left when they cleared fields so they could plant crops there back in the days of my great-grandfather in 1839. If you think about it, it was an immense project to clear the delta of all these trees. And they burned them. I think they pulled the stumps out of the ground with the mules, and it was quite a process. But for some reason, this tree survived. And why they would have left a tree pretty much out in the middle of nowhere is always an oddity to me. And I've tried to make a point of taking photographs of all these trees that I see. You still see them along the, you know, Highway 61, and you wonder, well, now, why did that tree survive? But the reason it's called the Visible Spirits tree is Steve Yarbrough, who's a wonderful fiction writer from Mississippi, put it on the cover of his book called Visible Spirits, which was based on a real event that happened in 1903 when Teddy Roosevelt appointed a black postmistress in the little town of Indianola, Mississippi. And that didn't really go over too well, and a bunch of people were killed. And I think at one point he was thinking of calling the book The Deadening. A lot of people got killed, and there's, you know, always been this kind of violence in the Delta that you just can't skip over unless you're a real Pollyanna. But the thing that I would like to say about Visible Spirits, and in general, I've always been a proponent of photography being very much connected to literature, because these are stories. All of these photographs are stories. In particular, you know, my story, I guess you'd have to say, is probably the story about this little postage stamp called the Delta. But I just like the idea of marrying words and images, and in this case, Mississippi literature. For instance, when the Delta Land book was published in 1999 by the University Press of Mississippi, we had a writer, Lewis Norden, who was from Itabena. Don't cry for me, Itabena. He wrote the foreword to the Delta Land book. And the second book that I did with the University Press was Delta Dogs, which was more or less a sequel to Delta Land of the indigenous canine presence, because the dogs are everywhere in the Delta. That author who wrote the foreword to Delta Dogs was Brad Watson. He's written quite a few books and been nominated for every prize. And then when I did Mississippi history, my portrait book that I worked on for many years, the color square portraits in natural low light, that was written by Richard Ford. So it was essential and important for me to have the connection between Mississippi writers and visuals.
What is a landscape? You know, if you're Ansel Adams and you photograph moonrise over Hernandez and think That's the quintessential landscape. But for me, it seems a little crazy to take this glorious nature and reduce it to, in this case, 24 by 30. But, you know, if you photograph a sunset and make a little print of it, or put it on Instagram, the way so many people do, it just seems crazy to me. For me, the landscape has to show a little something that's an interface between what humans make, whatever they build, their machinery, themselves, the trash they leave, all that kind of stuff, and how that fits in to our natural world. So in this case, you're reversing, you're not trying to see what's man-made that's just sticking out. Most of the picture is man-made, and you're trying to find the nature that's somehow embedded or surrounds it. But beyond that, it's a vertical. And normally, you think of a landscape as something horizontal because of the way the eye works. They read from left to right. They see in Western culture from left to right. Maybe Japan, it's different. You know, I'm just talking about where we are. And I've talked to painters. I think a lot of my influence actually comes from painters. But in Oxford, a friend of ours, Robert Malone, had a show at Southside Gallery, and I went in there. And he had 1, 2, or maybe even 3 vertical, wonderful landscapes. He's a great landscape painter. This is not an homage to him, but it is a vertical, because the subject matter demands it, really. Although I bet you I took a horizontal version of this, it just works better vertical. And beyond that, the buildings behind it are more modern. This is more Gothic. The thing that makes it work is not just the green trees and so on, but the crow, who's sort of dark and moody and Gothic, and the pointy nose and the pointy nature of spires in Gothic architecture, and even little snippets of friezes and sculpture that you find in many good cemeteries. But this one is Père Lachaise Cemetery, which in effect is like the most beautiful park you ever saw. As with many photographs, there's a story. How did it get there? And what made you stop and look at it and notice it? Well, half the battle is the light. We just happened to be sitting there having an illegal sandwich, sitting on another gravestone, somebody else's gravestone, and Maude was chucking little bits of bread, French bread. Seemed to me a shame because I love that bread, but the crow kept coming and coming and got in the perfect position. This is the tomb of Eloise and Abelard. It's a story of 2 lovers, and the parents found out, and then the boy was castrated, and the girl went to the nunnery. They still, after all of that, loved each other, and I can't remember how they actually died, but 500 years after that, they were moved here by Napoleon's Josephine. A lot of people, famous people buried here, Jim Morrison, Colette, Apollinaire. It's not that easy to get into this cemetery. Of course, I don't care a whit about that. I just care what it looks like. And there's nobody around. It's just you and it. So that's one of the reasons I love this place.
This is The Dog in the Fog, which was taken in Cassidy Bow in Sumner, Mississippi, virtually out the front door of our house in Sumner, of Jackson the dog, who's now become very famous, which is really amusing to his owner because, you know, he's just an ordinary old lab that lived in the town of Sumner where dogs run free, as Bob Dylan said. But I often thought this, you know, would probably be a pretty decent photograph even without the dog, but he seems to lend it just a kind of dimension that was a little bit otherworldly. And it was one of those moments, you know, where I'm just walking around down there in a fog, and here comes my neighbor's dog, and strikes this wonderful pose. But the spot that it's taken in is the exact same spot of the William Eggleston photograph of the black man and the white man standing in front of a white car. It was in William Eggleston's guide. That white man was my father, and the black man was a man named Jasper Staples. So I think it's just kind of interesting that's taken in the exact same spot. But the high point of this, which possibly is my greatest hit of all the photographs I've ever taken, because for some reason people love this photograph, is that Barry Hannah used it on the cover of Yonder Stands Your Orphan. And he thought Jackson the dog looked like a three-legged Confederate general. And he just absolutely insisted on that publisher using this for the cover of that book. So it's really become one of my greatest hits. And I think it's that people just relate to this mysterious black dog. Okay, this photograph is the dog on a log, which is ironically my second most popular photograph, which is in the same county as Dog in the Fog, but different places. This is a place called Sandy Bayou, which is, again, one of those places in the middle of nowhere. If you're a back roads road dog like I am, you do find a lot of out-of-the-way places. But I had seen this place, and it was a little gravel road, and I saw this beautiful cypress swamp. I thought, oh, that's just so huge and majestic and wonderful. It needs a photograph. And when I got out of the car, I realized, oh my God, there's a dog out there just sitting there. And he had, I believe, when I looked at the contact sheets not too long ago, he had traversed this log to get to the log he was sitting on, and he had some sort of prey, like a nutria, in that log. But for the moment that I took this photograph, and I was literally about to trip all over myself and have a heart attack trying to, be sure I got this photograph, he struck this kind of profile that, he was almost posing for the photograph. It was a little bit eerie and wonderful and funny. There's humor in this picture for me, in that smack dab out in the middle of nowhere, here's this, dog who looks like an old-timey movie actor. But it's funny how these two dog shots have a lot of resonance for people about what the Mississippi Delta looks like. It's the idea of, the freedom that these dogs have.
This is kind of the end of my black and white career. I've been in New York a couple years. I was stuck somewhere between trying to imitate Cartier-Bresson on the streets of New York, but at the same time, the kind of luminous, pristine, sharp as a tack quality of Walker Evans and his ilk for their clean, crisp, and oftentimes symmetrical images he had. I ended up with an 8x10 camera, which is literally, the film is 8x10 inches. So the detail is incredible. And one of the things it can do best, of course, is to photograph architecture, because you can correct angles. I happen to love architecture, not just public spaces, but private buildings too. And I did a series on rustication, and this is the Hoboken station. You would take the ferry, gone to this station, taken an Erie-Lackawanna train to wherever you lived in fox hunting country So instead of being a commuter coming from Scarsdale on the train to go work on Wall Street, you were coming from the nice parts of New Jersey. Those trains were already almost pretty old-fashioned, and travel was, more getting into the air and so on. After World War II, things changed. Taxes were taken away for people building airports. I sort of wish now we were back at this, but just as a building itself, there's the guy with the hat, there's the model, there's the Coke machine. That's an old-fashioned kind where you did the pop top, but you had to take the top and put it in the trash. And there's a little slot for it on the machine. This is a little row of payphone booths. They used to be banks of them in train stations. Pop in, there'd be a little counter and the phone and a door, and you'd be in your own little space. Anyway, as a black and white, now I can appreciate it because it's a pretty well-tuned image, but it's sort of the end for me of that kind of thing. And then when we get over here, still kind of at the end of the black and white career, again with the big format, 8x10. But unlike the train terminal, an unstructured building, it's still architecture, or I'm standing in the remains of what would have been some kind of architecture. And what's left is the building next door after a fire. So it's got a lot of structure to it, but it's very minimalist. So I don't know if that means I was moving away from too much Rococo stuff, or that's just what was there that day that somebody had told me, go on down and photograph, there's a building burned. And so that's what I did. And there you are, and you're looking at this door and wondering what went on between these two buildings, the one that burned and the one next to it that had a door. Was it part of the original plan? Did somebody add it later? Was it used to sneak in between one building and another? Was there some kind of hidden thing going on, the way there often is? Or a cask of Amontillado where you could hide someone away? Your imagination goes there. As far as shooting architecture and particularly rustication, it was a departure. But then I made another move and got away from black and white altogether, so it was a real departure. Not the end of the use of the 8x10 camera, but my mind had really switched to color, and color is a whole different animal. Over here we have the same camera, but it doesn't have that Walker Evansy pristine, pure luminance. It's more about how the various colors will give you a foreground, middle ground, background, and how your eye will be led around. This case, it's pretty simple lighting-wise because it's fluorescent light. I guess the only surprise is that the washing machines and the mural behind it, the cups are all kind of in the same blue-green color range. So I suppose that's partly why I took the picture. This one was actually my laundromat on 28th Street and 8th Avenue, Chinese Laundry. One day I went in and the whole mural was gone. And I asked the woman that ran the place, well, what happened? And because she knew me, and she said, oh, it's out in the back. I said, well, can I get that piece? She said, sure, no problem. And I went out in the back, and the only piece of the whole mural, this pile of canvas that was gone, was this section right here. So needless to say, that was disappointing. But I have talked to people about this and heard that painters would trade their art, especially if they were unknown and needed to pay a bar bill or something. They would trade a painting, and then, of course, later they'd get famous, and the owner of the bar could go up to Sotheby's and sell the painting. This one, I was told, could be a Larry Rivers painting. I've looked on the internet and no way for me to know if that's really the case. Anyway, it's something you could fantasize about. But this whole series is called Flatlands, and it's based on Vermeer's use of a camera oscura, which is essentially a ground glass lens and a 45-degree mirror. So on the ground glass, you would have tracing paper, point the lens somewhere, trace it, and then you would take that tracing and paint from it. The way today we would paint from a snapshot. However, the thing to remember, the important thing, the thing that links it to photography is the single point perspective. So every one of Vermeer's images has a center to it, which is exactly the way it is with a camera. Anyway, this series, of which there are about 15, was originally shown at the Corcoran Museum back in about 1978. So they're all interiors, a chest of drawers, a globe, a very two-dimensional painting on the wall, almost like graffiti. But it's also the greens, and they're not even that nice looking. Drawer handles some are up and some are down, some are in the middle. So you wonder maybe what kind of a household we're in. But it's also a kind of intimate, domestic scene that Vermeer would have painted. Again, that's that single point perspective. It's a little bit less evident. I'm so straight on. And same with this, similar. This is my mother's bedroom in Vermont. The advantage in this case is the 2 dimensions becomes 3 very quickly because of the chest that's in the mirror that's mimicking these 2 chests. So this is the way photographers think, is how to take a rectangle and find something that's happening in there or make something happen in it. In my case, it's more about finding and recording. It doesn't matter that you would know this, but I remember it perfectly well. In order to get this to work right, I had to take apart my mother's bed and the box spring in order to fit my camera and tripod it and get enough distance to take the picture. So for me, it was more or less a labor of love, and I'm thankful that my mother put up with it. I'm not even sure she knew I'd done that till it was too late.
This is a photograph that was taken of my son, Schuyler Clay, and a lady named Emma McShane, who was just a marvel of a person who helped me with my first 2 children. And we were about to have lunch, and Schuyler was throwing a fit, and the light was coming in from a window across the table. So I knew it was not going to be, you know, one of those things where I could afford to wait. And I had to make a choice between being the mother who goes and comforts this poor child, or am I going to be the photographer who tries to take this incredible photograph? And I was just very fortunate that Emma was kind of the stand-in to be the mother while I was being the photographer. And it happened quickly, and the light was just absolutely perfect. And, you know, the screaming infant, it almost has a real beatific religious quality to it for me, and that could be all tied up with the dilemma I felt about being a mother or photographer. And luckily, because of Emma, I didn't have to make that choice. When we were in the dark room, it was hard to make a print of this, but I have to say there have been vast improvements, especially in this area where her apron is, and the light was, you know, really blowing out. There's some versions of this print where you can't see all this detail, so I have to say kudos for Langdon Clay and his technical abilities as a printer that sort of made this print come to life like it never has. The photograph here is of my friend Bonnie Claire Marrow, and the photograph was taken at her house, which is kind of out in the country in Tallahatchie County. The thing that I love about the photograph is the way the light is hitting her face, very Vermeer-like. It's those last few minutes or even seconds sometimes of the light in the late, late afternoon before the sun goes down. Particularly contrasted with her golden outfit is this green car that belonged to her uncle, Mr. Choctaw Marrow, and it was just sort of the perfect prop. She just almost looks like she's completely out of time, and her gaze is universal. It's a good subject. Many of the photographs in this room are my color portrait work, which is in this book called Mississippi History, which is a compilation of, about 30 years of portrait work with my old Rolleiflex twin lens reflex. When I was asked why I was doing this project, I never really had much of an answer besides I was looking for people in the right light. And that was most often sort of a late afternoon, orangey, natural light. The premise of the Mississippi History book was just my meandering around, taking photographs of everything. So many of the people that I ended up making these photographs of, I knew they were either family members or people in the community or friends. For the most part, they were aware that I was there with the camera and just kind of carried on regular life. So I was fortunate in that respect. Oftentimes we established this sort of agreement about me taking the photograph and them letting me and presenting whatever it is that they want to present, or I don't know. It seems like a contract in these portraits because I wanted it to be a collaboration between the subject and me as the photographer. Now, this dog may have had another idea. These guys, you know, the late afternoon light in a Tutwiler, Mississippi, they were just out there having fun, and they didn't seem to mind that I was there recording it. Ended up taking a lot of photographs of children, too, strangely enough. I'm not a rabid kid person, but many of my subjects are children, and it was a wonderful way to record my family. The children were wonderful subjects, and we were always together. And this particular edit, which Gerhard Steidl, who was the publisher of the book, did, is an interesting one. But when I look at a book of mine, I always think about what we left out. Like this photograph of Eudora Welty. And Eudora Welty, as you know, was a great, great writer. Right on up there as the most important writer in Mississippi. She was one of those writers who really understood the nuance of language and vernacular speech, and she just covered a lot of ground in her writing, but it was not that well known until maybe around this time or a little bit later that she had also been a photographer. Her book, One Time, One Place, which came out in 1971, was a collection of her photographs that were taken during the Great Depression. Eudora had been hired by the Works Progress Administration. Pretty sure that was under the New Deal, FDR. And She had a job as a junior publicity agent, and she was sent around the state of Mississippi to scout out interesting stories like bookmobiles, new roads, county fairs, and things like that that might be of interest during that time. But she said she later went back on her own time to photograph the people and places she had encountered. So, though she never considered herself a real photographer, as she said, she left a comprehensive record of what Mississippi looked like in the little towns, and she photographed Black people and white people. And she said it was so easy for her to go around and take the photographs in Mississippi because she was kind of part of the place, and nobody ever questioned her, you know, what she was doing or why. And I think in many respects, I feel that kind of grateful privilege myself, in that I just had sort of free range and creative license to go anywhere in Mississippi or I wanted to take a photograph. I never really ran up against any kind of opposition. I feel a real kinship with her as a writer and a photographer. It could have been this day, or it could have been another day when I visited her, that she told me the story of being in Paris in the 1930s, and she had pretty much the same rig as I do, this Rolleiflex. I mean, it was the exact same camera. And she had lost this camera in the city of Paris and, you know, was understandably distraught about it. And she decided, well, I'll put an ad in the Lost and Found in Le Monde. So she put the ad in the paper and, you know, translated it from English to French. And she was trying to say that her Rolleiflex, it came with the beautiful leather case, which they were made for these cameras. That was a work of art in itself. By and by, a few days later, she was talking to some French friends of hers, and she said, I didn't get one single person with any leads about this camera that I lost. And they said, well, you know, we saw that ad in Le Monde, and we thought it was some sort of joke because the way it read in French was lost camera wrapped in veal skin. So the people that did see this ad thought it was some insane Dada experimental joke. And so nobody ever returned her camera to her, but she still thought that was funny enough to tell me, you know, 50 years later. But she was full of a lot of funny stories, and she knew a lot of interesting people, and, you know, people came from all over the world to Jackson, Mississippi, pay homage to Eudora Welty. But I just like the idea of her relaxing here, and looks like she's contemplating. This is a photograph of Charlie Jacobs, who was in a band called the Tangents, which many people call the house band of Mississippi. You know, they just played some wonderful music, from blues to kind of rock and roll to New Orleans type music, but it was basically dance music. It was the kind of music that really made you happy. And this particular day, we had been riding around out in the country near Rosedale, Mississippi. This was over in Bolivar County, almost to the Mississippi River. And this place where we are in this photograph was Doe Row Mound, which is near Beulah, Mississippi. And he was showing me the grave in this old family cemetery of his great-grandfather, Charles Clark, who was the governor of Mississippi during the Civil War. So we go from governor of Mississippi during the Civil War to wild man musician. But he was very reflective here and had said to me at the time I was taking this photograph that this was the place where he wanted to be buried when he died. And, you know, I said, oh, it's gonna be a long time before you get out here. He died not that much longer after this photograph, so it's kind of eerie, and that's where he is now, in his final resting place out there with the old governor. But one of the funny things, or amazing things, supernatural things, whatever you want to call it, is when they were digging the grave for Charlie, oh gosh, how long has that been? 1997, I think. They were digging his grave, and there was an unmarked grave of some Confederate soldier in a glass-top coffin. And I sure as hell wish I'd been out there to get a photograph of that. Now, several people told me that story, but one of them was Willie Morris. And, you know, he did love a good story. So it could have been a fantasy of somebody's, but I'm pretty sure they really did find that glass-top coffin and covered it back up and had to dig in another spot. But that's typical Charlie Jacobs anecdote right there. Probably wrote a song about that.
All right, well, this is the 42nd Street Panorama. That side is 7th Avenue Broadway. This side is 8th Avenue. There are 22 vertical 8x10 negatives. Originally, they were printed, and we hand cut the prints, mounted them, and they were all glued down, and then the spaces between the prints, you'd take a magic marker and try and make it archival. And eventually we got to the digital era and were able to solve the seaming of those 22 images in a digital way and adjust exposures for the stores, which were often brighter than the outside buildings. And at this point, we've got kind of is what the street would have looked like to the eye, except for up in the three-dimensional part, in the sky, where certain things duplicate, that you see them twice, but they kind of look normal, so you don't know you've seen them twice. And then the other three-dimensional thing is the marquees from all the movies, because that was three-dimensional. But actually, the facade of each building is at the same level, which is not true for every street in New York. You could go to the Upper East Side, and those brownstones don't all end up on the sidewalk at the same place. But here on 42nd Street, they do. Anyway, it was made because we were afraid it was going to be all torn down in a matter of years. In the end, it took about 25 years for that to happen because of all the holdouts. A couple of these buildings were owned by people you had to pretty much wait till they died before you could get access to knock down the building. Anyway, I kept reading the newspaper, the New York Times. Oh, we're going to redo Times Square. And they'd have these wonderful drawings of skyways going from these buildings over to the other side of the street. And it all had this kind of futuristic tinge to it. I've always been there to record things for the Martians to come upon and see what it was like, in this case, in 1979. I had a crew of people because I was up on a ladder and therefore a little bit unprotected. So I had a bouncer and people to help lift stuff, big tripod, an 8x10 camera. Sometimes I had more than one bouncer because there were plenty of nutty people roaming around in the streets. They often wanted to know, what TV station is this from? And can you get me on TV? All this was going on within earshot, and I'm fumbling away with the controls on the camera. And my bouncer friend would just kind of con them and say, we're not shooting you or the street, we're shooting 43rd Street. and testing this lens for the CIA. And that would shut them up pretty quick, usually. Not always. I didn't feel in any danger because I had my people with me. But in some way, I suppose, it was a risk to come out here and photograph this thing. I'd already photographed the cars, which was color at night, so I wasn't afraid of that. As a photographer, I kind of knew what you do. You just put it on a tripod and let it go for a minute and just see what happens. That's kind of what we did. When it wasn't raining and, you know, when the weather was the same for each night. In spring, it would be 7:30 to about 10, because after that, they would have turned off all these marquees because the last show would have started and they didn't want to waste money on the power. So there was a certain window of time that we had on any given night. So these ladders are here for them to change out for the next night's movie. And this is a rack that holds all the letters that go in the marquee, and here's another one here. Because it was a minute-long exposure, there really aren't a lot of people in the image. So the ones that are in it were either leaning on something or waiting for a bus, because that like goes back to Civil War period, when they had rigs where you had to have your neck held tight for that amount of time of exposure. Anyway, this frame, the harem, it has somebody grilling a steak in there. You can actually see that. Then you have one guy sitting on a standpipe, another guy standing in front of the mail rack. And then there's a guy in a car just sitting there waiting, who knows. So this character's waiting for a bus. In between there, if you look carefully, there's a little dinette here, a luncheonette. There's a guy sitting right in here in this hat store. It's glass, a lot of glass, reflections. This is Kentucky Fried Chicken in there with a little girl happily eating her chicken. It's reflected on the other side of the street. And also on the other side here was a newsstand with all the international newspapers. You could go there at 4 in the morning and get papers and fashion magazines from everywhere around the world. All gone. That stuff is all gone. These are Alex Katz's paintings of women, and he's, I think, in his early 90s. I took a little print of this down to him in Soho a couple of years ago. Anyway, of course, they're gone, but it makes you wonder what happened to them. Where'd they go? They're probably, you know, like in one of those warehouses, like the floats from Mardi Gras. That kind of place. Or maybe like, maybe somebody ended up with them. It's pretty cool. Somebody's old office, but there's a nice painting in there and some dead plants, so on. I mean, you can see what kinds of lives people have had here. One of the things about photography, if you live long enough, you can plagiarize yourself. So 32 years after this, in 2011, I photographed this exact same image again, but this time digital. It only took 3 or 4 days. All these theaters that were kind of either porn theaters or even legitimate theaters had now been returned to serious play theaters. The street itself is more kind of Disney, Vegas, extruded plastic. It's all sketchers, or it's some huge video billboard constantly moving. And I mean, you get a headache just walking there. The first time, not once. I mean, there were plenty of nuts came up as we were working away, but not once did a cop ever come and say, "What the hell are you doing on this street? And what is this? What is this huge camera?" and so on. Then in 2011, which is, of course, after 9/11, you had to file and get permissions from the movie people down at City Hall. and they had all these kind of Darth Vader outfitted police and in heavy, kind of almost military vehicles and so on, roaming around. So if you weren't certified, you were not allowed to take a photograph on this street. I guess one advantage of that is they kept people from messing up our picture, like hot dog vendors. So if you were trying to photograph this, you would not be able to even see anything because they stand up this high and they would be blocking a lot of the buildings. So the police actually, believe it or not, helped with that. But that illustrates exactly what it is about photography in general, is you can, and in fact you should, photograph things over and over and over to see the variations and how things change. And of course, in New York, once a building is gone or they knock it down, it doesn't take too long before that vacuum is filled. And also, there is something I forgot to mention. This character here was a Polaroid photographer. He used to have that beautiful Polaroid 669. It was big. It was like a 6:8 ratio. And there were people on the street who had a kind of a rig with a flash. So if you wanted your picture done, he would do it and you sit around talking to him and wait till it develops and peel it, put it in a little cardboard frame. And, you know, now, of course, iPhone, who needs people like that? So this character here, he wanted to be in it. I said, it's a minute-long exposure, so you gotta stand really still the whole time. And then the middle of the minute exposure for that frame, he got a customer, turned around. So what you see in here is the flash in the shadow of whoever his customer was. Anyway, so Maude and I, we had one of these Polaroid guys take our picture. She says it was in 1977, not long before there was this blackout where, of course, no garbage was picked up for weeks. The whole city was really not smelling too good. Anyway, that same night, on this same street that we got that Polaroid, which we still have, we went to a record store, I think it's called Haven Records, and got a gospel album called Mother, which is different artists, but all songs about mother. Normally, you wouldn't want to take too many people, especially a nice date like Maude, up and down this street. But somehow at the time we were young and foolish and adventurous, and she was willing to do it, so hey. Anyway, those were the days when you could just wander up and down and enjoy yourself, just looking at stuff.
I call this the Goth Guy, the Wisteria Goth Guy, because here in the middle of nowhere was this kid who looked like he could have, you know, been around on the streets of New York or San Francisco or some urban area. I was riding out in the country one more time in Tate County, which is connected to Tallahatchie, I believe, and was photographing this sort of dilapidated store. And this guy, this really a kid, emerged from a trailer back here somewhere, which I had not really seen or checked out at all. And he came over and told me that that was his grandfather's old store. And I said, oh, well, I hope you don't mind if I take a picture of it. I just thought it was so beautiful. He just pretty much let me do this photograph, and it ended up being such a nice portrait of, to me, a kind of vulnerable-looking guy. But he seemed rather nostalgic about the grandfather and the store, and made me believe that at one time maybe it was more of a community than it was then, which was really nobody but him and me standing out in the Silverino, Mississippi. But I think one of the reasons it's so effective to me as a photograph is just this wild purple wisteria just kind of running riot in the background. It punctuates his very dark clothes and sort of serious demeanor. Just softens all of that, you know, and it almost makes it seem like a dream. You know, if you took away that wisteria from this photograph, I don't think it would be a great photograph and it wouldn't say as much, but these happy accidents are, you know, just as exciting to me as if I had gone in with the idea of, you know, oh, there's this person in the perfect shaft of light and I need to take this photograph. This was just a little bit different and it was spontaneous. I have to wonder where he is now. Well, if I had a mentor or somebody that I had really tried to emulate as a photographer, it would probably be this man, Bill Eggleston. I was going to the Art Academy in Memphis, and he suggested that I be his so-called apprentice or assistant. And I put that in quotes, sort of, because I didn't have to do very much except just ride around with him in the late afternoon light all around Memphis and parts of Mississippi. So I was able to observe what kind of photographs he was taking. And at the time, I was shooting black and white, 35 millimeter, you know, just more or less kind of bad student work. At that time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do or take pictures of or anything else. I just went with the flow, and the flow was Bill Eggleston was taking these amazing color photographs. And he was just about 10 years into his success in 1988 of having had that color show at the Museum of Modern Art called William Eggleston's Guide. That had really put him on the map. So he was a good teacher. He, you know, gave me photography books to study, and he had stacks and stacks of prints around the house. He's always been a very prolific worker and photographer, and just, you know, like would hand me a stack of a couple thousand pictures, and I'd look through them all. He's just a real interesting person to hang out with. It took me a number of years after this to realize that to differentiate my photography from his, I would need to do something a little bit different, even though we were both photographing in color. I knew I wanted to take what I could that I had learned about Bill Eggleston's work, but I wanted to make something of my own, so I decided that I would really study people, or what I call portraits, which was not something that he really specialized in, although he does have a lot of amazing photographs of people. Per se, he never did that as a project. So this is at Bill's house in Memphis, and he is an inveterate collector of all sorts of things, and one of them is beautiful shotguns, which he doesn't use in any way other than just to collect them. He's not a hunter. So he was showing me his latest purchase that day, and the light was just absolutely perfect, coming through this kind of yellow, you might say Art Deco stained glass window that's about 2 stories tall. So I had the advantage of the light, and I had the advantage of this, you know, totally relaxed person who was just looking at his shotgun and was not really posing for me or caring that I was taking a picture of him. So it was pretty much perfect atmosphere. That was 1988.
This series of cars is where I pivoted from black and white to color. I did that with 8x10, but before I did that, I switched in 35 millimeter. Happened very fast. I saw, and I have an image in the car's book of a car at night in black and white, and in the passenger seat is the spare tire. So believe it or not, this is where I got the idea for this series. But I, in my mind, had already switched to color because, as I said in the foreword, night was its own color in the city. Part of the reason for that, the city of New York had switched from mercury vapor, which is a very greenish, to sodium vapor, which were brighter, warmer, and in fact, they were so bright. It was so bright, the trees would grow at night. So whatever money they saved on the cost of the lighting, the electricity bill for the city, they had to pay the tree trimmers to come and cut the trees and because they were growing 24 hours a day. So they were trying to save money. They were trying to use less wattage and have brighter light because everybody wanted to feel safe. So it was an interesting experiment, and for me, it worked out wonderfully. The thing that makes that exaggerated color work is Kodachrome film, really. I think it was developed in the 40s, right after World War II. It's a especially rich kind of film and used over and over by many of the great National Geographic photographers. Kodachrome itself is a hybrid film. It's still got silver halide in it. It's basically a black and white film with color, which is different than the way Ektachrome works. So it's a tricky film in that you can't develop it. You can't take it to a lab in New York and get it developed. You have to send it to Kodak, some strange 14-bath process, proprietary Kodak deal. So you'd buy a roll of film and it would come with a mailer and you would send it off. And in 2 weeks, they'd send it back in a little yellow box with 36 slides in it. Get your friends together, put them in a projector and just, I don't know, just look at them. Something about turning out the lights, blowing it up big. It was wonderful. And then doing that, projecting it, and even projecting it with other people around, you start to get a sense of what's working. So next time you go out, you're hunting for the thing that's working. And the next time you go out, and then the fourth or fifth or eighth time gave you kind of an inkling of what it means for a thing to become a series. Oh, in the old days, an album would have 12 songs. So Sgt. Pepper's would be the greatest concept album of all time. At that time, we were hoping to make with photographs a kind of concept album, if you will. A group of photographs can reverberate with each other. So that's really what gets to be fun about it. I started going out and I would shoot a whole streetscape, 2 or 3 cars, something with color in it. And within weeks, I got it winnowed down to 1 car and 1 background. It took 2 years. I'd go out every couple of days. Again, these are 40 seconds at f8, 40 millimeter lens with a tripod, of course. 40 millimeter lens allowed me to be between 2 cars on the other side of the street. So I wasn't going to get run over, but the lens was long enough it would get me in on the 1 car and the 1 background. So I'm not really a car nut. It's more about New York City in the mid-'70s, which was totally broke. It's trash everywhere. But if you're in your 20s, you don't care about that. You think it's beautiful. And so you're already in this magical experiment of color film. And in the end, the cars, in a way, found me. I was on a hunt, for sure. This is one of those cases where you know what you're looking for, but in a weird way, you get to a point of reflex where it knows I'm there, and it just tells me, here you go, I'm your photograph. Start clicking. And it's visceral. Of course, people are walking by, they have no idea what the heck you're up to. It's a wonderful, magical moment of an artist and the subject passing, meeting in the middle.
This is my current portrait work, which spans from about 2012 to now. Once again, I'm always looking for the people in the right light. And this particular photograph is of Susan Worsham looking through a biology slide. She travels with all these biology slides that are part of her project. She's a photographer that's based in Richmond, Virginia, and she incorporates these into her work. Sometimes she photographs through the slides, sometimes she just takes photographs with the slides in her picture. And she came to Sumner in 2014 to join this little group of people that we called it the Photography Collective. And we did some real interesting things and went all around the Delta. And one of the things we did was the coon hunt, which was an actual raccoon hunt during the supermoon. It was truly an amazing natural event where, you know, the moon was so big and so bright that it looked like bright lights, big city lit up. There were no guns involved, but it was 9 photographers chasing these coons through the cornfields and the swamps. I declined to go after the coon at the very last stretch because one of the guys with the dogs told me that he had lost a dog recently to an alligator. And I thought, that's it. I'm gonna just go back to the four-wheeler and sit there, enjoy the supermoon, and somebody else got the shot. But it was great fun. Anyway, that's how I met her. We had mutual friends and we were in this photography collective together. I took this photograph of Susan on our porch in Sumner.
This is the car series, but displayed on a kind of large-ish TV screen. It's a little unfair if you're in a show to do it like this, simply because the effect of a television up in a corner in a bar or in a restaurant or anywhere in public that you might go is that your eye just tends to flip up to it. And so it made it easy for me to get lots more attention with this way of showing the pictures than by just putting prints on the wall. I have proof in that I saw a family transfixed watching this and not seeing any of the other artists in this show in the Fondation Cartier in Paris. It's also a much cheaper way to show a lot of things, especially things in series, as it would have been projected in a slideshow. Anyway, it goes on and on like that. But the novelty here really is the method of display. The other thing we tried to do was the kiosks. Same idea, just smaller. This museum is a teaching museum, so we kind of designed this around all ages. So for kids, obviously, this being related to Instagram, this is accessible. I mean, you get to flip through it yourself, and you could use these things in all kinds of different ways. to show extras of work that's on the walls, to show separate projects that are not maybe wall-worthy, but are worthy or still good and can be seen in a smaller frame. This little project, I had an identity crisis way back in '71 in California. I dropped out of college. I've been out there for about 8 or 9 months, goofing around. I didn't really have a job. So to get out of my doldrums, I decided, well, I'll take a picture of myself every day of the year for 1 year. That'll give me a job. It'll give me something to do. And it did. And a lot of times I took the picture at about 11:59 at night because I would often forget. I'd be occupied doing other stuff. But for me, it worked. And it also made a kind of the original selfie record. It wasn't just to see me. That wasn't the idea. But I had traveled across the country, moved to New York, this Monticello, which later on I did an entire coffee table book on. There's kind of a more of a selfie type shot with David Frost and my sister. And there's my dear mother coming to visit me. And honestly, it makes me wonder, because some of these are kind of cool. There's a guy with a bird on his shoulder, you know. What's up with that? So this is really where I began my career. So these are the first photographs. But I couldn't see this as prints on the wall. But here on this, I could see if somebody had a minute to just goof around. It seemed like it was worth putting in this form on the kiosk.
This was probably my favorite thing in the whole show, which was to take my collections of things that I had at home in various places in the house, photographs and buttons and just things that I went through the house. You know, I'd love to see those things in a little drawer because I knew we had the opportunity to make this 3D collage. So some of the things in here are very much related to my life and to photography. This photograph in the foreground is a picture by Euphus Ruth, who's a wonderful Mississippi photographer. And he decided at one point he was going to take up on the project that E.J. Belloc, who was kind of a Toulouse-Lautrec figure in New Orleans around 1900, the turn of the last century. And he took all these beautiful photographs of a lot of the women that worked in Storyville as prostitutes. So many of Belloc's pictures, the prostitutes either had their faces obscured or his brother was a priest in New Orleans. And in some of these glass plates, the faces of the women are scratched out, and there was conjecture of whether it was done by his brother, whether it could have been done by the prostitutes themselves who didn't want to be identified because they were, you know, really working in these brothels. So that's what that glass plate is. Me as a New Orleans prostitute about 100 years later. And here's one that's very interesting, and it's the tintype of a dog. And it's kind of a rarity. People photographed their children and their sweethearts, and a lot of times post-mortem photography, they photographed their dead children because that was the only image they would ever have. And sometimes they'd have to wait for a photographer to come, you know, travel for a week to come photograph the dead kid. And, well, anyway, I think this picture of the dog, he's obviously in some little table in a studio. It's very heartening that that person loved their dog so much that they wanted to go to the trouble of having a professional photographer make a tintype. And let's see, there are photographs of my mother and grandmother. It would have been like 1920 something. And Bill Eggleston as a child in the house in Sumner with this lady, Lucille Fleming, at that time, which would have been about 1940 or 41 maybe. And interestingly enough, she worked there for, I think, a total of 59 years. Try that on for size. But one of the first pictures that I took with my Instamatic camera, or maybe it was the Brownie, but it was one of those square format cameras I had as a kid, I took of Lucille and Jasper in 1966 in front of the Plunder Room. And you may ask what the Plunder Room is. The Plunder Room, it's plural, there are two of them. It was pretty much the repository of all the things in the house that nobody was using, but didn't really throw away, just sort of, they moved to another life in the Plunder Room. So, I mean, I plunder there, have all my life on a regular basis just to go pretty much see what was discarded by various generations out there. The metal, and these are lead figurines, by the way, this giraffe and the nurse. I probably need to be psychoanalyzed to come up with why both of those are so important to me. Found them in the Plunder Room and just immediately thought, I've got to get these back in my life. It doesn't make a lot of sense, some of the things I collect, except that they have a connection that a lot of times it's something very specific and other times it's mysterious connections. And I also love dice. I collect all kinds of dice and old buttons, and this little book that was from my mother, who was born in 1918. Probably this was during Prohibition, but when people would go on vacation, they would bring back weird little souvenirs. And this one says, "The Story of the Last Swallow from Chicago." And, you know, you think it's probably a little book about a bird, and you open it up, and here's this little teeny tiny bottle of scotch, The Last Swallow. I also have some things that I didn't put in here, you know, which were little miniature porcelain commodes from Niagara Falls, and people collected strange souvenirs back in the day, but a lot of those were thrown into the Plunder Room, be plundered by myself later. There's something I've always loved about putting together collections of things, and this drawer to me is just kind of like the hidden story. And my little Miss Ten Commandment bracelet, which I never wore, by the way, but it's in there. And I pin up things next to my desk and try to be inspired by various quotes, but this is one of my favorites. Any work that has any honesty and a sufficient degree of craftsmanship or power eventually finds an outlet. I do have faith in that. So as freelance photographers and artists who set out without any real guarantee that, you know, our work was ever going to be shown or any of it was going to ever be published, I think one of the commonalities that Langdon and I have is that, you know, we believed that that's what we were going to do, no matter what. And in many ways, it's paid off in that, you know, it's kept us occupied for about the last 40 years. Telling shot of two of us, the photograph of these two young people that we hardly recognize anymore. where we were at a wedding up in Vermont, and I put the photograph of us having so much fun in this little frame shaped like a television set. It's kind of a permanent show that's been running for the last 40 years, although we look a little bit different. Many things have remained the same in that we're both still dedicated to photography and dedicated to each other, dedicated to living here in Mississippi. There's some real treasures in here.
That's the drawer, and that's all this much more personal mementos. Up here, we've got shows we've been in: Charleston, South Carolina, Paris, London in 1978, Cars, Delta Dogs, that's Maude. This was from a show at the Invitational with Carlyle at the museum in Jackson, Mississippi Museum of Art. Yeah, that's the first I knew Carlyle. Corcoran Gallery, that was one of the first shows I ever had. Polaroid funded this series of shows. Sally Mann was in one of them anyway. I was in this one. Proves that we've been somewhere, done this, done that. But it doesn't mean we don't have hopes for other projects. I don't feel so old that I couldn't have another retrospective or have some hope of doing new work that will become other books that will then become other shows. So, you know, we just carry on and keep going, right? All right, good.
These are our children.
Schuyler, Anna, and Sophie.
We came back to Mississippi and raised them here. Now they're all grown up, but we met in New York in 1976.
The Museum of Modern Art for Bill Eggleston's first one-man color show.
It's been a long haul.